My wife was cheating on me and planning to take my money, but I transferred everything to my mom, and when she found out, she was, "Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I never thought I'd find myself writing here, but I guess life has a funny way of catching you off guard. Let me start from the beginning because, well, our story wasn't supposed to end up like this. Sarah and I have been together for 10 years, 6 of them married. I'm 38, and she's 36. Honestly, for most of that time, I thought we were living a dream. We met at a mutual friend's party when I was 28, and she was 26. I remember being immediately drawn to her laugh. It was loud and contagious, like she wasn't afraid to be herself. She had this way of lighting up a room just by walking into it. We clicked that night over a shared love for indie music and bad 90s movies, and from then on, it was like we were inseparable. From the start, Sarah was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Supportive, smart, and funny as hell. She had this way of making even the most mundane things fun. Grocery shopping? She'd crack jokes about how the vegetables judged her when she passed them by. Cleaning? We'd blast music and turn it into a dance party. Life with Sarah was easy. It felt like home. We had shared dreams too. From the beginning, we talked about building a life together. Traveling to Greece, buying a house with a big backyard, maybe even starting a family. Those dreams felt like ours, and we worked toward them as a team. When I lost my job at 32, Sarah was the one who kept me going, reminding me of my worth and pushing me to find something better. And when she wanted to start her own photography business, I supported her every step of the way, even taking on extra hours at work to help fund her first camera and studio space. We celebrated each other's wins, big and small. I still remember the night we stayed up until 2 a.m., drinking champagne in our tiny apartment, celebrating her first big client. She was glowing, her eyes sparkling with excitement, and I thought, this is it. This is what happiness looks like. Marriage didn't change much between us, at least not at first. We bought a modest house in the suburbs about a year after our wedding. A cute little place with a front porch and a backyard just big enough for barbecues. We settled into a routine, but it was a good one. Weeknights were for Netflix marathons and takeout, weekends for hiking or trips to the farmer's market. We were that couple everyone envied, the ones who seemed to have it all together. But looking back now, I wonder if I missed something, some subtle shift or crack in the foundation that I just didn't see. Because as perfect as everything seemed on the surface, life has a way of throwing you curveballs when you least expect it. It wasn't until around our 9th anniversary that I started to notice little things. At first, they were so small that I almost ignored them. Sarah seemed distracted, like her mind was always somewhere else. She started forgetting little things, like the fact that I had an important meeting or that we had plans with friends. When I'd bring it up, she'd laugh it off, saying, "Guess I'm getting old." And I'd let it slide because, honestly, who doesn't get forgetful sometimes? But then there were other things. She started working later and later at her studio, saying she had to catch up on edits or meet with clients who could only come by in the evenings. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sarah loved her work, and I loved that she was passionate about it. But it started to feel off. She'd come home exhausted but wired, like she was running on adrenaline, and when I'd ask her about her day, her answers were vague, just busy or nothing exciting. Our sex life, which had always been great, also started to dwindle. At first, I chalked it up to her being tired from work. I mean, who wants to get frisky after a 12-hour day? But even on weekends, she seemed distant, always finding excuses, headaches, stress, you name it. I tried to be understanding, but it was hard not to feel rejected. Then there was her phone. Sarah had always been pretty open with it, leaving it lying around the house or handing it to me to look something up. But suddenly, it became glued to her hand. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she'd lock the screen and put it down like she didn't want me to see. I'm not proud to admit this, but one night, while she was in the shower, I tried to check her phone. It was locked with a passcode I didn't know, something she'd never done before. When I asked her about it, she laughed and said, "Oh, I locked it because I kept but dialing people. You know how clumsy I am." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. But something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. The real breaking point came about a year later. By this time, the distance between us felt like a canyon. We still went through the motions, dinner together, polite conversations, but it felt hollow, like we were two strangers living under the same roof. I missed her, the real her, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd brush me off, saying, "You're imagining things," or "I'm just stressed with work." One night, while she was working late at the studio, I decided to surprise her with dinner. I thought maybe we just needed some time to reconnect, away from the stress of our routines. So, I grabbed takeout from her favorite Thai place and headed to her studio. When I got there, the lights were off. At first, I thought maybe she'd gone out to grab coffee or something, but when I called her, she didn't answer. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I walked in, and everything looked normal. Her desk, her equipment, even her favorite mug sitting on the counter. But she wasn't there. Then I saw her laptop, open on the desk, and that's when everything unraveled. There was an email on the screen, half-written, addressed to someone named Jay. The subject line was "Last night," and the message read, "I can't stop thinking about you." The way you, my heart stopped. I couldn't read the rest. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the takeout. I don't remember much after that, to be honest. I think I left the food on the counter and drove home in a daze. When Sarah got back that night, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the hell we'd gotten here. I guess I should have trusted my gut when Sarah started acting differently. But when you've spent a decade with someone, you want to believe the best in them. You don't wake up one day expecting the person you've built your life with to suddenly feel like a stranger. It started with her phone. Sarah had always been pretty casual about it, leaving it on the kitchen counter or tossed on the couch when she wasn't using it. I remember once, years ago, when I needed to use the GPS on a road trip, she handed me her phone without a second thought. "Here, use mine," she'd said. "Yours always freezes." But now, her phone never left her side. If she wasn't holding it, it was in her pocket. If she set it down, it was face down on the table. And the passcode, she had never bothered with one before, but now it was locked tight. When I asked her about it, she gave me the same answer as before. "I kept but dialing people." She laughed, but the laugh felt forced, like she was trying too hard to make it sound casual. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Lots of people keep their phones locked these days, right? But then there were the calls. Sarah used to talk on speakerphone all the time. Whether it was with her mom, her best friend Lily, or even clients, she'd pace the kitchen while chatting, making herself a cup of tea or folding laundry as she talked. But now, whenever her phone rang, she'd glance at the screen, excuse herself, and disappear into another room to take the call. She always had a reason. "It's just loud in here," or "It's a client, I need to focus." But the conversations were short, hushed. And when she came back, she acted like nothing had happened. One night, I decided to test her. It was a Saturday, and we just finished dinner. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter, and she quickly grabbed it, glancing at the screen. I caught a glimpse of a name, Mia, before she turned it away. "I'll be right back," she said, already heading toward the bedroom. I waited until I heard the door close, then crept down the hallway and stood outside. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but I caught fragments. "No, he doesn't know. I told you, I'll handle it." My heart sank. Who the hell was she talking to? And what didn't I know? When she came back out, I pretended I hadn't noticed anything. But the tension between us was palpable. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was going on, and Sarah was hiding it. It wasn't just her phone or the calls either. She seemed completely uninterested in anything related to our future. We'd always loved planning things together. Trips, home projects, you name it. About a year ago, we'd started talking about renovating the house. We'd saved up close to $50,000, and we had big plans. Turning the garage into a home office, redoing the kitchen, maybe even adding a deck. But now, whenever I brought it up, Sarah would shrug and mumble something about not being ready to make decisions yet. And when I suggested taking a trip, just the two of us, to reconnect, she'd sigh and say, "I'm too busy with work right now. Maybe later." It was like she didn't care anymore. About us, about our life together. I felt like I was carrying the weight of our relationship on my own, and every time I tried to talk to her about it, she shut me down. "You're overthinking," she'd say. "I'm just tired." But it wasn't just tiredness. It was something else, something she wasn't telling me. One night, I confided in my best friend, Ethan. We'd been friends since college, and he was one of the few people I trusted completely. We met for drinks at our usual spot, a dive bar downtown that we'd been going to for years. Ethan listened as I poured everything out, the phone, the calls, the way Sarah seemed so distant. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and frowned. "That doesn't sound good, man," he said. "Have you thought about, I don't know, following her? Seeing where she goes when she says she's working late?" The idea made my stomach churn. I wasn't the kind of guy who snooped or spied. But the thought of not knowing, of continuing to live in this limbo, was worse. "I don't know, Ethan," I said. "That feels wrong." Ethan shrugged. "Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. If she's hiding something, Don't you want to know? I couldn't argue with that. So a few nights later, when Sarah said she had to stay late at the studio, I decided to see for myself. I waited until she left, then grabbed my car keys and followed her. My hands were shaking as I drove, trying to stay far enough behind that she wouldn't notice me. She didn't go to the studio. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the other side of town. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car and walked inside. She wasn't alone. A man was waiting for her, a tall guy with dark hair and a confident smile. They hugged when she walked in, and then they sat down together at a corner table. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way they leaned toward each other, the way she laughed at something he said, it was like watching a scene from someone else's life, not mine. I stayed in my car, heart pounding, until they finally left. They didn't hug again, but the way he touched her arm before they parted made my blood boil. Who the hell was he? And what was he to Sarah? When she came home that night, I didn't confront her. I couldn't. I needed to know more before I said anything. So I started paying closer attention, watching her patterns, listening for clues. And slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. The man from the cafe, his name was Jason. I saw it in a text that popped up on her phone one night when she left it on the kitchen counter for a brief moment. Looking forward to tomorrow, it said. Jay. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This was my wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted for a decade. And now, she was sneaking around with someone else? I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was piling up, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't looking for answers that day. I wasn't even trying to be suspicious. But sometimes, the truth has a way of finding you when you least expect it. It was a Saturday morning, and Sarah was getting ready to head out. She told me she was meeting her friend Lily for coffee. I hadn't seen Lily in a while, but they'd been friends forever, so I didn't think much of it. I was in the kitchen making myself a second cup of coffee when she came downstairs, dressed more carefully than usual. Dark jeans, a fitted top, her hair styled just right. She even put on makeup, something she rarely bothered with unless we were going out somewhere special. Lily must be in for a treat, I joked, raising an eyebrow. She smiled, but it felt off. Forced. I just felt like putting myself together today, she said lightly, grabbing her bag. Don't wait up for me. I'll probably be gone a couple of hours. Something in the way she said it stuck with me. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. As she walked out the door, I found myself staring after her, a knot forming in my stomach. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking things again. But after about 10 minutes of pacing around the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. On a whim, I grabbed my car keys and decided to follow her. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I was probably being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my head. She didn't go to the usual cafe she and Lily loved, the one downtown with the big windows and the mismatched chairs. Instead, she drove to a small coffee shop in a quieter part of town. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car. My heart was pounding as I saw her pull out her phone, glancing around like she was checking for someone. She didn't go inside right away. Instead, she stood by the curb, her phone pressed to her ear. I rolled down my window slightly, just enough to hear bits and pieces of her conversation. I'm here, she said, her voice low. Yeah, almost done. Don't worry, everything will change soon. She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. No, he doesn't suspect anything. I told you, it's under control. My stomach dropped. The knot in my chest tightened as her words replayed in my mind. Almost done. Everything will change soon. He doesn't suspect anything. What the hell was she talking about? And who was she talking to? I strained to hear more, but she was pacing now, her voice dropping even lower. I could only catch fragments. The plan. Just a little longer. Trust me. I watched her hang up and glance around before heading into the cafe. My mind was racing. Was this about Jason? Was she planning to leave me? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, debating whether to go in after her. But I didn't. Instead, I waited. About 20 minutes later, she came out, holding a to-go cup. She didn't look around this time, just got into her car and drove off. I followed her at a distance, trying to stay inconspicuous. To my surprise, she didn't head home or to Lily's place. She drove across town to a small park, the kind with jogging trails and picnic tables scattered under shady trees. She parked her car and got out, walking toward one of the trails. At this point, I couldn't take it anymore. I parked nearby and got out of my car, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice me. She walked for a few minutes, glancing at her phone now and then, until she reached a bench near the edge of the trail. Sitting there, waiting for her, was Jason. I froze. He stood up when he saw her, and they hugged, longer than friends should. She said something I couldn't hear, and they both laughed. Then they sat down, leaning close to each other, talking in low voices. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to march over there, demand to know what the hell was going on, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, hidden behind a tree, watching as my wife smiled and laughed with another man like she didn't have a care in the world. After what felt like an eternity, they got up and started walking together down the trail. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. Instead, I stumbled back to my car, my mind racing with questions. What was she planning? What did she mean when she said, "Everything will change soon"? And why the hell was Jason still in the picture? I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. By the time I got home, Sarah was already there, acting like nothing had happened. "How was coffee with Lily?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as possible. She didn't even flinch. "Good," she said, smiling. "We had a lot to catch up on." I stared at her, searching for any sign of guilt, but she was as calm and composed as ever. It was like she was a completely different person, someone I didn't know at all. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I needed more information, more proof. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, replaying everything I'd seen and heard. The phone call, the meeting with Jason, her cryptic words. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than I'd realized. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth. It all started innocently enough. At least, that's what I told myself. About a week after I saw Sarah with Jason at the park, she brought up the idea of organizing our finances. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner when she casually mentioned it. "You know, I've been thinking," she said, pushing her plate aside. "We should probably get all our financial stuff in order, like everything. Bank accounts, passwords, bills. Just in case." I looked at her, trying to gauge her expression. She was scrolling through her phone, not meeting my eyes. "In case of what?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She shrugged. "You never know. What if something happened to one of us? It's just smart to be prepared." On the surface, it made sense. We'd always been pretty laid back about finances, dividing responsibilities without much thought. I paid most of the bills, she handled groceries and household stuff. We had a shared savings account, but kept our individual checking accounts separate. It had worked for years without any issues. Still, something about the timing felt off. I couldn't forget the phone call I'd overheard, or the cryptic things she'd said. And then there was Jason. My mind kept circling back to him, to the way they'd looked at each other in the park. Was this sudden focus on finances connected to whatever she was hiding? "Sure," I said after a moment, trying to sound casual. "That's probably a good idea." Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into the task with an intensity one hadn't seen from her in months. She printed out bank statements, gathered credit card bills, and even dug up old tax returns. She wanted everything in one place, neatly organized in a binder. At first, I went along with it, but the more I watched her, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the thoroughness. It was the way she approached it, like someone on a mission. One night, as we were going through our accounts, she brought up the idea of consolidating everything. "It would be so much easier," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "One shared account, one set of passwords. That way, we both have access to everything." "Easier for who?" I joked, but my stomach was doing flips. Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. "For both of us," she said quickly. "I just think it makes sense." I nodded, pretending to agree, but inside, I was panicking. Was this about money? Was she planning to take everything and leave? The thought made me sick. I needed to figure out what was going on, but I didn't know where to start. The next day, I called Ethan. He'd been my sounding board throughout all of this, and I needed his advice. We met at a diner on the edge of town, a quiet spot where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I told him everything: Sarah's sudden focus on finances, her insistence on consolidating accounts, and my growing suspicion that she was up to something. Ethan listened, frowning as I talked. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "That doesn't sound good," he said finally. "Have you thought about talking to a lawyer?" "A lawyer?" The idea hadn't even occurred to me. "Isn't that extreme?" "Maybe," Ethan admitted. "But if she's planning something, like taking the money and running, you need to protect yourself. A lawyer can help you figure out your options." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. It felt like overkill, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was right. If Sarah was hiding something, I needed to be prepared. That night, I started looking through our financial records on my own. While Sarah was in the shower, I pulled up our bank accounts on my laptop and started going through the transactions. Most of it looked normal: grocery store runs, gas, her photography expenses. But then I noticed a series of withdrawals from our shared savings account. They weren't huge amounts, just a few $100s at a time, but they added up. Over the past 3 months, she'd taken out nearly $5,000. My heart was pounding as I stared at the screen. What was she doing with that money? And why hadn't she told me? I closed the laptop quickly when I heard her coming downstairs, my mind racing. I needed to confront her, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed more information. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention to Sarah's behavior. She was still glued to her phone, constantly texting or making calls in private. And she kept pushing for us to finalize the finances. "Have you updated your passwords yet?" she asked one morning over coffee. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page." "Not yet," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'll get to it," she sighed, clearly annoyed, but didn't press the issue. I could tell she was getting impatient, and that only made me more suspicious. What was she waiting for? What was her endgame? One evening, while she was out meeting a client, I decided to check her office. It was a small room at the back of the house, filled with her photography equipment and stacks of photo albums. I'd never had a reason to go through her things before, but now I was desperate for answers. I started with her desk, opening drawers and flipping through papers. Most of it was what I expected: receipts, contracts, client information. But then I found a manila folder tucked at the back of the bottom drawer. Inside were printouts of emails, dozens of them. They were between Sarah and Jason. My hands were shaking as I read through them. The messages were mostly vague, but there was enough to confirm my worst fears. They'd been meeting regularly for months, and it wasn't just business. One email from Jason stood out. "Once everything's finalized, we'll finally be free. I can't wait to start our life together." I felt like I was going to be sick. I put the folder back where I found it and closed the drawer, my mind racing. Sarah was planning to leave me, and she was trying to take everything with her. That night, I barely said 2 words to her. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do. I needed to confront her, but I couldn't do it without a plan. I couldn't let her know what I'd found. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. Every day, I woke up with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. Sarah's behavior hadn't changed. She was still glued to her phone, still pushing me to consolidate our finances, still pretending like everything was fine. But now I knew better. The emails with Jason had made everything clear. She was planning something, and I needed to act fast. I didn't know where to start, so I called Jeff, a close friend of mine from college who also happened to be a lawyer. Jeff and I had known each other for over 15 years, and he was the kind of guy you could always count on: level-headed, sharp, and brutally honest. If anyone could help me figure out what to do, it was him. We met at his office downtown, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Jeff greeted me with a firm handshake and a concerned look. "You sounded pretty stressed on the phone," he said, motioning for me to sit down. "What's going on?" I didn't hold back. I told him everything: Sarah's sudden focus on finances, the withdrawals from our account, the emails with Jason, and my growing fear that she was planning to leave me. Jeff listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with every word. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Alex," he said, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It sounds like she's gearing up for a divorce. And if she is, you need to protect yourself now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I nodded. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jeff leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "First things first, we need to talk about your assets. What do you own? What's in your name?" I rattled off the list. The house, which was worth about $750,000. Our joint savings account, which had about $150,000 left after Sarah's withdrawals. My investments, totaling around $350,000. Jeff scribbled notes as I talked, nodding occasionally. "Okay," he said when I finished. "Here's the deal. If she files for divorce and everything's still in your name, she can claim half of it, or more, depending on how good her lawyer is. But if those assets aren't in your name, they're protected." "What do you mean, not in my name?" I asked, frowning. Jeff smiled faintly. "It's called asset retitling. Basically, you transfer ownership of your assets to someone you trust. Someone who won't let Sarah get her hands on them. Do you have anyone like that? A family member, maybe? My mind immediately went to my mom. She'd always been my rock, the person I could count on no matter what. My mom, I said. I trust her completely. Jeff nodded. Perfect. We'll retitle the house, the savings, and the investments in her name. It's completely legal, and it'll keep everything out of reach if Sarah files for divorce. But we need to act fast. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Jeff handled most of the legal side of things, but there were still countless forms to sign, documents to gather, and details to iron out. I had to be careful not to let Sarah suspect anything, which wasn't easy. Every time she asked me about the finances, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to give her just enough information to keep her from getting suspicious without revealing what I was really doing. One night, while Sarah was out, I met my mom at her house to explain everything. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a concerned look on her face as I laid it all out for her. I don't know what she's planning, Mom, I said, my voice breaking, but I can't let her take everything I've worked for. I need your help. My mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Of course, sweetheart, she said. We'll get through this. Whatever you need, I'm here. Hearing her say that was like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. We finalized the transfers over the course of 3 weeks. The house was officially retitled in my mom's name, as were the investments. The savings account was trickier, but Jeff helped me open a new account in my mom's name and transfer the funds. By the time everything was done, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief because I knew my assets were safe. Guilt because I hadn't told Sarah. But then again, she hadn't exactly been honest with me either. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more unsettling. Just 3 weeks after we finished everything, Sarah filed for divorce. I came home from work one day to find her sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, her expression unreadable. We need to talk, she said. My heart sank. I knew what was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a slap in the face. I've decided to file for divorce, she said, sliding the papers across the table toward me. It's for the best. For both of us. I stared at the papers, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to demand answers, to ask her why she was doing this, but another part of me knew it didn't matter. The Sarah I'd married was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I'll give you some time to look these over, she said, standing up and grabbing her phone. We can talk more later. I didn't say anything as she walked out of the room. I just sat there, staring at the divorce papers, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. But as devastating as it was, I also felt a small sense of vindication. I'd seen this coming, and I'd taken steps to protect myself. She wouldn't be able to take everything from me. Later that night, I called Jeff to let him know. She filed, I said, my voice flat. Jeff sighed. I'm sorry, Alex, but at least you're prepared. She won't be able to touch your assets. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks, Jeff, for everything. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but wonder what Sarah's next move would be, and whether I was truly ready for whatever was coming next. When Sarah finally said the words, it wasn't a dramatic fight or a tearful confession. It was cold, calculated, almost rehearsed. It was a Wednesday evening. I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted after a long day, and found her waiting for me in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her laptop closed on the coffee table, her posture stiff. I knew instantly that something was wrong. We need to talk, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. I dropped my bag by the door and hesitated, my chest tightening. Okay, I said cautiously, sitting down in the armchair across from her. She took a deep breath and looked at me, her expression as blank as her tone. I've decided to file for divorce. There it was. No preamble, no softening of the blow. Just the blunt truth. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the words. What? I finally managed to say. Why? Sarah crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, like she was about to give a presentation. I need to find myself, Alex. I've spent so many years putting this marriage first, sacrificing my dreams, my goals. It's time for me to focus on me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sacrifices? I repeated, my voice rising. Sarah, we've both made sacrifices. That's what marriage is. But we've also built a life together. What about everything we've worked for? She shook her head, her expression unchanged. I can't do this anymore. I've been unhappy for a long time, and I've been trying to make it work, but it's just not enough. I need more. More, I said, my voice shaking. What does that even mean? Is this about Jason? Her eyes flashed for a split second, but she quickly composed herself. Jason has nothing to do with this, she said firmly. This is about us. About me. And I've made up my mind. I leaned back in my chair, feeling like the wind had been knocked out of me. I wanted to argue, to beg her to reconsider, but I could tell it was pointless. She'd already checked out, and nothing I said was going to change that. What happens now? I asked quietly, dreading the answer. Sarah reached for her laptop, opened it, and slid a folder across the table toward me. I've already filed the paperwork, she said. My lawyer will be in touch, but I wanted you to see the terms first. I opened the folder with trembling hands and skimmed through the pages. It was worse than I'd imagined. She was demanding half of everything. The house, the savings, the investments, and even the Tesla Model X we'd bought a year ago. On top of that, she wanted $3,000 a month in alimony. You've got to be kidding me, I said, my voice rising again. Half of everything? Alimony? Sarah, this is insane. She didn't flinch. It's fair, she said simply. I've contributed to this marriage just as much as you have. I'm entitled to my share. Your share? I snapped, slamming the folder shut. Sarah, I've been the one keeping us afloat for years. I paid for the house. I covered the bills when you were starting your business. And now you want to take half of everything? How is that fair? She stood up, smoothing her skirt with her hands. I'm not going to argue with you, Alex. This is what I've decided, and I'm not changing my mind. If you have a problem with it, talk to your lawyer. And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there with the divorce papers in my lap, feeling like my entire world had just come crashing down. The next day, I called Jeff. He wasn't surprised when I told him what had happened, but he was furious on my behalf. She's out of her mind, he said after I'd read him the list of demands. Half of everything and $3,000 a month? Does she think you're made of money? She knows exactly what I have, I said bitterly. That's the problem. Jeff sighed. Look, the good news is that we've already protected your assets. The house, the savings, the investments, they're all in your mom's name now. She can demand all she wants, but there's nothing left for her to take. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Sarah had been planning this for months, manipulating me, pushing me to consolidate everything so she could make her move. And now she had the audacity to act like she was the victim? I'm not giving her a damn thing, I said firmly. She can fight me all she wants, but I'm not going to let her take what isn't hers. Jeff nodded. Good. Stand your ground. We'll respond to her lawyer and make it clear that you're not going to roll over. And if she wants to play dirty, we'll be ready. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, tense phone calls, and sleepless nights. Sarah moved out of the house and into a rental apartment across town, but she left most of her things behind, saying she'd come back for them later. I couldn't stand the sight of her stuff, so I packed it all up and shoved it into the garage. Her lawyer sent over a revised settlement proposal, but it was just as outrageous as the first. They were still demanding half of everything, plus alimony, plus the car. Jeff tore it apart and sent back a counteroffer that basically told them to go to hell. Through it all, Sarah stayed cold and distant, like we were nothing more than business partners negotiating a deal. Every time I saw her, I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. She'd made up her mind, and there was no point in trying to change it. One day, I ran into Lily at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, like she wanted to bolt, but I cornered her in the produce aisle. Lily, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Do you know what's going on with Sarah? She hesitated, glancing around like she was afraid someone might overhear. Alex, I don't want to get involved, she said finally. This is between you and Sarah. Lily, please, I said, my frustration boiling over. I just want to understand. Did she ever say anything to you? About being unhappy? About Jason? At the mention of his name, Lily's eyes widened. I have to go, she said quickly, grabbing her cart and walking away. Her reaction only confirmed what I already knew. Jason wasn't just some fling. He was the reason Sarah had blown up our marriage. And now she wanted to walk away with half of everything I'd worked for, like it was no big deal. But I wasn't going to let her. Not without a fight. After Sarah's initial demands, and the cold way she approached everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on. She had blindsided me with the divorce, and her insistence on taking half of everything I owned only deepened my suspicions. Something didn't add up, and I was determined to figure out what it was. I started small, combing through her social media accounts. Sarah had always been active online, posting photos from her photography gigs, sharing travel memories, and occasionally posting a selfie with a vague inspirational caption. But now I was looking at her posts with fresh eyes, searching for anything out of the ordinary. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. There was a man, James, who seemed to comment on almost every photo she posted. His comments were always friendly, sometimes flirty, but nothing outright incriminating. Amazing shot, he'd write under one of her photography posts. Or, looking gorgeous as always, under a selfie. At first glance, it could have been harmless, but the frequency of his comments caught my attention. I clicked on his profile and scrolled through his photos. He was in his early 40s, with a clean-cut appearance and a smile that looked a little too polished. He had the kind of profile that screamed midlife crisis. Gym selfies, pictures of expensive cars, and captions about grinding and living your best life. He didn't seem like the kind of person Sarah would normally associate with, which made his constant presence on her posts even more suspicious. I decided to dig deeper. I started going back through Sarah's posts from the past year, looking for any interactions between her and James. The more I looked, the more I found. He wasn't just commenting on her public posts. He was liking older photos, tagging her in memes, and even sharing her photography page on his own profile. It was clear that they had some kind of connection, but I couldn't tell how deep it went. That's when I decided to reach out to Mark. Mark and I had been friends for years, and he was the kind of guy who had connections everywhere. If anyone could help me find out more about James, it was him. We met at a bar that Friday night, the kind of dimly lit place where nobody pays attention to the conversations happening around them. I told Mark everything about the divorce, Sarah's demands, and my suspicions about James. He listened quietly, sipping his beer, and nodded when I finished. "I've seen this kind of thing before," he said finally. "People like Sarah and James. They're playing a game, Alex. And the only way to win is to stay 2 steps ahead." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. "If she's working with this guy, and I'd bet money that she is, then they've got a plan. They're not just after the money. They're after control. She's probably feeding him information, and they're strategizing how to get as much out of you as possible in the divorce." The thought made my stomach turn. "So what do I do?" Mark smirked. "You fight fire with fire. If she's plotting behind your back, then you need to do the same. Start gathering your own information. Build a case. And if you find anything, use it to your advantage." He pulled out his phone and tapped on the screen for a moment before handing it to me. "Here," he said. "This is a message I got from a mutual friend. I wasn't going to show you, but I think you need to see it." I took the phone and read the message. It was a screenshot of a conversation between Sarah and James. In the messages, Sarah was explaining how they could get everything they need through the divorce. She mentioned the house, the car, and even hinted at trying to negotiate a higher alimony payment. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just speculation. This was proof. Sarah and James were working together, and they were trying to bleed me dry. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark shrugged. "A friend of mine knows James. Apparently, he's not as careful as he thinks. He left his phone unlocked at a party, and someone took a screenshot of the messages. They sent it to me because they thought you'd want to know." I stared at the message, my mind racing. This changed everything. I finally had something concrete to work with, something I could take to Jeff. But it also left me with more questions. How long had Sarah and James been plotting this? And what else were they planning? The next day, I met with Jeff at his office and showed him the screenshot. He read it carefully, his expression growing darker with every line. When he finished, he set the phone down and looked at me. "This is big," he said. "If we can prove that she's conspiring with this guy to manipulate the divorce, it could work in your favor. But we need more." "More," I said, feeling overwhelmed. "Like what?" "Emails, texts, anything that shows they're working together. If we can establish a pattern, we can argue that her demands are based on bad faith. It might not completely absolve you, but it could weaken her case." I nodded, determined to do whatever it took. Over the next week, I threw myself into the investigation. I went through old emails, bank statements, and even the text messages Sarah had sent me over the past year, looking for anything that might connect her to James. I also started keeping a record of everything she said and did, just in case it could be useful later. Meanwhile, Mark kept digging into James's background. He found out that James had been involved in a similar situation a few years ago, helping another woman divorce her husband and walking away with a hefty payout. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. James was a professional manipulator, and Sarah was his latest partner in crime. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. Sarah had already betrayed me by cheating with Jason, but now it was clear that she'd been lying to me on an even deeper level. She wasn't just leaving me, She was trying to destroy me. One night, I confronted her. She had come by the house to pick up some of her things, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. "How long have you and James been planning this?" I asked, my voice cold. She froze, her hand hovering over a box of books. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Sarah," I snapped. "I know about the messages. I know what you're trying to do." Her eyes widened for a split second before narrowing into a glare. "You've been spying on me?" "I'm protecting myself," I said, "because clearly, you have no problem stabbing me in the back." She crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" I said, stepping closer. "I know about James. I know about your plan to take everything you can get out of me. And I'm not going to let it happen." For the first time, she looked uncertain. But then she straightened her shoulders and sneered. "Good luck proving anything," she said. "You think you're so smart, Alex, but you're not." She grabbed her box of books and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, my hands clenched into fists, vowing to do whatever it took to stop her. The day of the mediation arrived, and I woke up with a pit in my stomach. This was it, the moment where everything was laid out in the open. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing. Sarah and her lawyer weren't going to take the news about the assets lightly. Jeff had warned me that they might try to intimidate or guilt me into caving, but I was ready for whatever they threw at me. At least, I thought I was. The mediation was held in a sterile conference room at her lawyer's office. The walls were a dull beige. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the long table in the center of the room felt more like a battlefield than a meeting place. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting next to her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Patricia Hayes. Patricia was everything you'd expect from a high-powered divorce attorney. Tailored suit, sleek hairstyle, and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Sarah, on the other hand, looked tense. She was wearing a navy blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She barely glanced at me as I walked in, her expression a mask of indifference, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was bracing herself for something. Jeff arrived a few minutes later, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing his usual no-nonsense expression. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a quiet, "Let's get this over with." I nodded, following him to the table. Patricia wasted no time diving in. She started by outlining Sarah's demands: half the house, half the savings, half the investments, the Tesla, and $3,000 a month in alimony. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as she rattled off the list, but I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, about control, about taking everything she could get. When Patricia finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands, giving Jeff a smug smile. "I think we can all agree that these terms are more than fair, given the circumstances," she said. Jeff didn't flinch. "Actually, we don't agree," he said smoothly. "And before we go any further, there's something you should know." Patricia raised an eyebrow, and Sarah finally looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "What's that?" Patricia asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Jeff reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, sliding them across the table toward Patricia. "As you'll see in these documents, all of Alex's assets have been transferred to his mother's name. The house, the savings, the investments, they're no longer his property." There was a moment of stunned silence. Patricia picked up the documents and started flipping through them, her confident expression quickly turning to one of disbelief. Sarah leaned over to look at the papers, her face pale. "What?" she said, her voice shaking. "What is this?" "It's all legal and above board," Jeff said calmly. "The transfers were completed weeks ago, long before your client filed for divorce. Alex no longer owns any of the assets you're seeking to claim." Patricia slammed the papers down on the table, her composure slipping. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You can't just transfer everything to avoid division in a divorce. That's fraud." "It's not fraud," Jeff replied evenly. "Alex acted within his legal rights to protect his assets. If you have a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with the court, but I can assure you, you won't get very far." Sarah's face was a mixture of anger and panic. "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising. "That house is half mine. I've been living there for years. I've put so much into this marriage. You can't just take everything away from me." I looked at her, my own anger boiling to the surface. "Take everything away from you?" I repeated. "Sarah, you've been plotting to take everything from me for months. You've been lying to me, conspiring with James, and using this divorce as a way to bleed me dry. Don't act like the victim now." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. Patricia, meanwhile, was scrambling to regain control. This doesn't change the fact that Sarah is entitled to alimony, she said sharply. She's sacrificed a lot during this marriage, and she deserves financial support. Jeff raised an eyebrow. Sacrifices? As I recall, Sarah's photography business has been doing quite well. In fact, her income over the past 2 years exceeds Alex's. If anything, she should be paying him alimony. Patricia's face turned red. That's ridiculous, is it? Jeff countered. We have the financial records to prove it. And unless you want to drag this out in court, I suggest you rethink your position. The room fell silent again. Sarah looked like she was on the verge of tears, her hands clenched into fists on the table. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the messages with James, the lies, the manipulation, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. Patricia finally broke the silence. We'll need time to review this, she said stiffly. But don't think this is over. Jeff smiled faintly. Take all the time you need. The meeting ended shortly after that. Sarah barely looked at me as she gathered her things and walked out of the room, Patricia close behind her. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to end, but at least I knew I'd done everything I could to protect myself. Jeff clapped me on the shoulder as we left the building. You did good, Alex, he said. Now let's see if they actually try to take this to court. I hope they don't, I said honestly. I just want this to be over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. Not completely. Sarah wasn't the type to give up easily, and I had a feeling she still had a few tricks up her sleeve. But for now, I'd won the first battle, and that was enough.